given that we're possibly looking at an upcoming code adoption cycle, wanted to go through for the members of the SEEB a little bit about really where energy code in Oregon has been, where we are now, and as we look toward adoption in the future, things that might be considered as you're looking at the next code cycles. Excuse me. In the recent past, we've had Mark Long from the division. He's come in and given sort of a history outlook of the state building code, sort of how the process started back in 1973, how it moved forward, sort of how we have a very unique system here in the state of Oregon on how codes are not only adopted, how they're enforced, how they're changed here via these boards. It was a pretty good presentation. I think some of you here have been through the presentation twice, if not maybe 3 times. Don't want to go too much in depth, but we will be looking back at that and some of the system that are in place as we move forward. One thing that you can see here is I couldn't find a copy of the 1973 code, but I did find the 76. In the 73, or at least a working cover that looked good, the 73 version did have energy provisions. The very first code had statewide provisions for single-family residences. So from 76 to, for some of us old-timers here remembering the energy compliance manuals that we had through the 80s and 90s, all the way up through the current 2017 Oregon Residential Specialty Code, and soon probably a new structural code and energy code coming out. One of the things about our code system, of course, is this board here, which is represented by 5 other boards, of course, that are here to provide input and background and public comment. Just, again, a reminder of how well I want to go through how the system's working and how well it has worked, given the expertise not only from this group but from the public process that we have here in Oregon. One thing before we get into the real heart of it, there are a couple of background and disclaimer slides we wanted to get into here first to sort of, as we're moving into a code adoption process. One was that we wanted to really look at sort of the board's sort of principles for code adoption, things that we try and keep in mind. First is really keeping that long view. Looking ahead, you know, it's not just about a snapshot in time today. It's looking at how codes progress, where we can move things that, you know, we've developed really good code in this state, not just the energy code, but the residential codes, the plumbing codes, the electrical codes, the elevator board codes, and et cetera, et cetera. That we've taken, you know, and that some of the things we developed here, you know, are really quite advanced. We at the division are taking calls from a lot of different places on any of the codes. We're getting calls on the drainage plane work from Sweden, believe it or not. We've had calls from on wood-fired pizza ovens from Georgia, New Hampshire, and most recently Florida. So some of the things we do here attract attention in other states. And part of it's how we've taken long view on things. And looking at a coordinated approach. We get buy-in from the stakeholders. This is what leads to the success of our code here. It's not a rule-making process where, you know, many other government agencies, you know, you have a rule, then we show it to the public, and they show it to the public and then say, yes, do you like it, yes or no, and we're over and done with. We've had buy-in, which has led to consistency. It's led to people knowing the impacts. When a code does come out, that, you know, when you're out there in the field building, you don't get surprises during either plan review or inspection. There's that buy-in and knowing that across the state, you're getting the same product. When you're looking at a focus on performance and choice, again, through this process, people can bring in ideas that are new and different, but one of the things we look at is to provide extra choices. If something new comes in, it's not to make that the mandatory piece and, maybe provide benefit to one particular industry or company. It's provide additional choices for people to find ways to comply with code. And it gets you more flexibility of how you can build, how you can design your projects. When we get to on your choice, we like to base our code on evidence, and that's why we have the stakeholders here saying whether, giving that review of the evidence that's provided, you can weigh that and say, does this work or not work within code? And sometimes when it's needed, we look for independent verification. If we need additional information, we go out and look for it. But bottom line, we try and look for consistency. All of these add up to a consistent product you get across the state. No matter where you are, whether you're in an urban or rural setting, small building, large building, everyone is getting the advantage of a safe, affordable, and efficient structure when it comes to our energy code. One thing about the focus look, and don't overlook, is that, when you're talking about focus on performance, we're not saying don't ignore a focused approach on something that might need to be looked at. It's that you really want to have a clear compliance path, something where you don't have an arbitrary language in the code that it's enforced one way here, looked at differently someplace else, where you know that the building official can tell you, yes, this is how you comply with code, and you can get the job done and moving quicker. Now for the disclaimers, your mileage may vary, batteries not included on this, and a little background, I'm an engineer, I can get overly technical at times, I'll try and keep this at really the 30,000 foot level. Don't want to get too hung up in the figures here, but whenever you're talking about energy code, there's really not a perfect perspective. There are lots of ways of looking at it. We're just here today really to provide some extra perspective, additional ways of looking at this, knowing that as we move forward, you're going to want to be able to have all of the information available for you. When you look at data for energy, a lot of it relies on an energy model. And energy models are assumptions layered upon assumptions, layered upon assumptions, and then they guesstimate based on those assumptions how that one particular building may function, but you're estimating not just the shape of the building, the materials in the building, how they interact, the systems, the lighting, the air conditioning, but also how many hours a day it operates, how many people are in there, how many computers are turned on or off. So there are a lot of layers involved, but it's a good tool for getting sort of a general idea of where you are. But from the industry, no two engineers are ever going to agree on, all of those assumptions. But it's a good starting place, but every energy model is going to be just slightly different, but all of them can be right. When you're looking at code, you're also looking at costs, and as we know, costs can vary pretty widely. We've seen the costs of steel and copper and wood just all over the place over the past 20 years. It will never be the same. Differences between suppliers. When you're getting a cost on how a code change happens, supplier or contractor A may be getting his windows from one company. They may even be seeing their costs go down because their supplier has a new factory and they already were 90% or were past the code. The next supplier comes in and says, well, my costs are much more because the person who I've been buying for 20 years has to change my supplies. So when you talk about costs, there's a lot of fluctuation there. And of course, as we know, that's even before you start getting into considerations of things like inflation, costs of materials. We're all in a busy construction period here. We're all seeing that labor is short. So if you're labor intensive, your costs are going up. But 2 years from now, your costs may be down. So when we start throwing out numbers, we're not trying to be super precise here because, again, there's lots of perspective on this. And same with things like the cost of energy. If you're looking backwards or forwards at energy costs, who would have thought that 10 years ago we were looking at importing natural gas, and today we're talking about building export terminals. So it makes some of the analysis a little more difficult. So when we talk about costs and energy in this, we're really maintaining fairly high-level looks at where we are in the code. And again, when the division needs more precision look at energy, we do currently contract with the University of Oregon, the Energy Studies and Buildings Laboratory. We want an independent third look. We want them to give us an outlook on what's happening in the code. When we look at buildings and building types, the U.S. Department of Energy has a set of specific building models that they use. So the feds are tracking the changes in model energy code at the national level. We use those same pieces so that we're looking at the same shape building, the same amount of window area, same amount of wall area. We're using the number of people they put in the building so that we can align with how other people are looking at code when we're looking at energy. And the main thing, we just don't want to be, accused of cherry picking answers. We're going to try and maintain with where the feds are going with it. So where are we with code today? Well, from the division perspective, and I think from the work of these people, I think we're doing pretty well when it comes to national codes. The 2014, I think, didn't get as much credit as we think it should have, but the 2017 is really a nationally leading code. It's a very good code. We're going to, of course, have the University of Oregon do some energy modeling for us to compare that to where the national model code is. We feel, of course, our statewide system, compared to other states, we do get better return because we get that consistent return throughout the state. On the commercial energy side, we've had the University of Oregon look at our 2014 commercial code, and they've determined that it's equivalent to ASHRAE 90.1 2013. We'll be one of 6 states for the feds at this level. We'll also be looking at the next commercial code. I think it's not a big leap to go well beyond or above and beyond the 2013 version of ASHRAE 90.1. Again, the flexibility that this group has. You can look at both model codes, standards such as ASHRAE 90.1. You can look around and, take the best pieces and know how it works well within this group, getting feedback from the different members of the board who represent other boards. You can look at high-intensity uses. Where are places where the Oregon code could maybe get the best bang for the buck, particular to our state and our economy. Again, looking at other best practices that may be brought in from public comment. And, of course, there's the wonderful phrase again and again you hear about low-hanging fruit. The one thing about your board is to play on low-hanging fruit a little bit more. Many other places are limited to just looking at the apple orchard. Where's the low-hanging fruit there? You're free to look down and see, oh, I might be stepping on a strawberry patch right now, or someone can bring in a public proposal and say, I know where a blueberry bush is. So you have that flexibility to build a better code, and we'll sort of look at again, when we're talking about national rankings, some of the rankings that you hear out there sort of, we'll look at perspective as sort of like a who's who list. I rank here, you rank there. The general consensus of where model codes are, U.S. Department of Energy publishes this very map here that shows where codes are. It's not very clear on here, but the Oregon we're trying to get the feds to catch up with the map, will be in this second darkest green here, equivalent with ASHRAE 90.1 2013. But when you get to perspective, this is where you hear that Oregon was worse than Alabama. You may have heard that thrown around. It was actually put in front of this board, I think, once. When we look at different codes and different states, and how the Oregon system works, state of Alabama, yes, did adopt a quote, their legislature said ASHRAE 90.1 2013 would be the mandatory statewide code, but each jurisdiction in Alabama is free to adopt what they want. And Alabama's largest city, Birmingham, in their city technical code, they When they get to adopting the 2015 IBC as their baseline building code, they delete Chapter 13 without substitution. When they talk about their residential code, they delete Chapter 11 energy efficiency. All references to the codes shall not apply. So if you go to their website and look at their plan intake sheet, there's no reference to energy codes. Have been to other cities in Alabama like Mobile and Montgomery and Auburn. These cities have all modified their city building code. A few others are still on just the 2003 IBC as their adopted codes. So again, the statewide system seems to work pretty well to get consistency for everybody in the state. So with that, we're going to do a little history lesson here on the residential code progression slide. Not asking people to look at this. The main thing is the highlighting that you see on this sheet. Don't panic, don't worry about numbers. The highlighting shows between the 1996 code and the 2017 code when there was really a revision. Some number changed, some figure changed, some new piece was added. If you look at this, you can see, well, it looks like nothing really happened between, and we'll go to the next slide for a little bit more detail, that 1996 through 2005, not much really happened. We were adopting new codes. We were making changes in other pieces, mechanical, structural codes, the electrical codes were all having changes, but it looks like nothing happened between 1996 and 2005. Well, that's one perspective. However, if you note the little circled item on here, Oregon went to R38 insulation in the attic and R21 in the walls in the 96 code. And the model code did not catch up with Oregon until the 2006 IECC. So these are different perspectives you can have on this, is that it took them a while to catch up with us. However, in the past 10 years, since the 2008 code, where we brought in the first additional measures table, pick one from the table, 2011, we updated and went to pick two. We're showing highlights of probably the most commonly used sections there. We added bathroom fan controls due to the Construction Claims Task Force. In 2014, some of the federal standards updated that affected us. Also, we added some water heater measures, and some small tweaks in the code were brought in about air sealing in homes. And of course, there's the 2017 code. So you can see that there's been a lot that's happened in the code over time. And so before we get into the 2017, because I'd really like to show you a bit more about that, would like to show you a bit on the existing housing stock, the stuff that's been built during, what effect this has had. We feel this gets overlooked a bit of the good work. Again, these are charts that sort of put this from some other internal research we were doing. If you note the blue line on this sheet, and on the right side, that says the number of annual housing starts, U.S. Census Bureau and other sources. Taking those, we looked at the number of housing starts. How many buildings were constructed between 1980 and 2016? Let's say the start of the 2017, the upcoming code. Want to look at the effect of that. You can see, in 1980, we started about 15,000 homes. We had that drop off through the recession in the 80s, going from left to right as you're following the blue line, back up to the big peak before the big housing crash of the mid-2000s, and then climbing back up again once more. So we're looking at housing stock. The green is sort of the grand total. We have about 500,000 single-family and two-family homes that were constructed between 1980 and 2015. Again, technical presentation. General perspective on this is, on the far left-hand side, we've got the year 1980, all the 15,000 homes that were built in 1980. The little teeny blue line there is, what if Oregon had just adopted model code, okay? The blue bar represents national model code equivalent, sort of estimating how much energy those homes would use, and the green bar is an estimation of those same homes as they were built to the Oregon code. So there's an energy difference. The next group over of 1981 is the cumulative, we're looking at cumulative effect of the 1980 and 81 homes, then the 82 homes, the 83 homes. And when you get to the far right side, for the year 2016, all of the 2016 all of the homes built between 1980 and 2016, if they've been built to model code, would have the blue bar here, that much energy use, somewhere around 75,000 billion BTUs. And Oregon homes, because we've had the stock of homes in 2016 will have used about 7 to 8,000 billion BTUs, or 7,000 trillion BTUs less than they would have if Oregon had just adopted model code. But we can look at some other states, and this is a little exaggerated on the line, but other states didn't adopt model code until much later than Oregon did. So their slope is going to start out a little behind. So they've got this stock that's sitting there. I think we forget that we've got this stock of homes. I'm pretty happy with my 1995 constructed home and the performance I'm seeing from it. And even if they had adopted code, if another state had adopted code late and then just followed model code, they're still going to follow sort of this path right here. And we're getting this benefit of starting early. Like with your 401k or your IRA, Oregon invested early, we invested often, and we're seeing the return of that. All homeowners, no matter where you are in the state, you're getting an energy benefit from having us adopt the fact that these boards have adopted energy provisions for single-family homes for so long. You can get into different measures of, all of these red bars that are in the bottom of this, which are the differentials. If you sum them up, it probably represents, maybe up to 200 trillion or more BTUs of energy saved by that housing stock since we started constructing those homes. It's the equivalent of almost turning off every single, a year's worth of energy from all residential construction. That would include all of the condos, apartment buildings, townhomes, and single-family homes. It's saved enough to sort of make up for an entire year's worth of residential energy use. So now we're going to look forward to the 2017 provisions, and we've heard some comparisons to our neighbors, and we thought we'd give you a little look at how we do compare to them, and for the 2017 code to show you how successful that really is. When it comes to comparing to our neighbors to the north in Washington, we have almost identical prescriptive requirements for the thermal envelope of the home. We have pretty much the same requirements as far as windows, roofs, ceilings, our wall insulation, et cetera. This is both states have sort of an additional measures system. Washington has a point system. They also include the size of the home for the number of points. But when you start out with the basic home, we're fairly comparable. Better on just a few pieces in Oregon. Washington has a few other little pieces where they're better. We have mandatory requirements that were added, for shower flow and a few other pieces that have been added. But we'd like to give you a sort of a comparison, but then we'd have to compare to under 1,500 square foot homes. The typical home for 2,400 square foot, Washington has somewhere around well over 300 different combinations we'd have to try and compare menus to. But some of our homes will be better, some will be worse, but we're really comparable with Washington, and I think we can say that both states are doing extremely well. But when it comes to California, they have a prescriptive, here's your menu path of exactly, or your recipe path. Follow this recipe, here's how you can build a home in California. And it's easy to compare between the two states because along the border, California has a code for, say, a home in Crescent City, California. We can look at a home built in Oregon, in Brookings, Oregon. We can do the same for a home that's built in, say, Klamath Falls, comparing that with California's Climate Zone 16. We got Tule Lake and, say, Wairika, or even up at 6,000 feet at Lake Tahoe. So we're going to look at the envelope, some of the equipment things, just sort of the bare prescriptive requirements for the state of California. Oops. So before Oregon gets to its prescriptive, or to its additional measures, so the baseline envelope for a home in Oregon, we wanted to compare that Oregon home with California. So Brookings versus Crescent City. If it shows up in blue, this is the percent better thermal performances for Oregon. Red will be California. We're in the roof or attic, we're at R49, California is R38. Underfloor insulation, R30 versus their R21. Windows and doors, same differences are happening there. Oregon's better, has a more restrictive requirement. So on the U factor, lower U factor is better. We require better skylights for our basic unit. We require slab edge insulation for residences in Oregon. California has none. Basement, again, better. California makes up for it in that they have a more restrictive wall requirement. They pretty much are telling people your baseline wall can't be the standard 6-inch studs. You need to put on continuous insulation to meet their requirement. If you were to move from, so that's the baseline thermal performance comparison. If you move to Climate Zone 16, which would include Wairika, Lake Tahoe, Tule Lake, they require a radiant barrier in the attic. So they look at doing additional savings for homes in those climate zones. They want to cut down on cooling load. But that's the difference on the envelope. So once you start adding the additional measures that are in Oregon's code, and what versus what's basic in California, both states, if you were to use envelope measure number 5, which is probably going to be one of the more commonly selected measures, both states are requiring ducts inside. Oregon does have a less restrictive. We do have an allowance for some ductwork outside of the envelope. When it comes to duct sealing, California requires you to do testing. But when it comes to home air sealing, they don't have specific requirements on the home air sealing. Envelope measure 5 is the one where we're adding the additional top plate sealing, which gets about a half to a full air change reduction when you do a blower door test on a home. While Oregon has a bit of an advantage on the ductwork side, when it comes to the air leakage side on Oregon homes, they're probably going to be in the lead on that. We continue to have people looking at homes and doing aftermarket studies to see where we're getting on that. When it comes to additional measures for equipment, most commonly picked measure for some time has been the high efficiency furnace, especially if you have a gas home. 94% versus 80% in California. If you're an electric home and you're selecting the heat pump measure, it's a 9.5 heat pump factor. Higher is more efficient. Both states, really, when it comes to water heaters, were restricted by federal mandatory prescriptive minimums or preemption by the feds. California does require you to pre-pipe for an instantaneous water heater. They don't require it, but they require you to pre-pipe for it. They also require what's called compact water line design. That gets us into, we can't really run or make major changes from this board to the plumbing code without a little bit of cooperation with them. And they do require that hot water lines greater than 3/4 inch and larger need to be insulated. Both codes now have low flow shower head at 2 GPM in their state codes, and California does also have the equivalent of water sense flow required for their lavatories and sinks. On the next page, when we talk about lighting, both states are now pretty much requiring 100% high efficacy lighting throughout the home, both interior and exterior. Oregon does provide an exception for 2 fixtures, just in case someone has something custom that they want to put on the exterior home or on the interior of the home. California has some additional requirements currently for residents to have occupancy sensors in their laundry rooms, bathrooms, and equipment rooms, sort of those unoccupied spaces. They have you put in an occupancy sensor there. They do require that exterior lighting have both a photocell and a motion sensor or something equivalent. So their exterior lighting has a little additional as well. California will mention their appliance standards. These are pieces that really we can't get into currently in the building code, so it's something that people are bringing in after the fact. You know, they might be bringing their refrigerator, their washer and dryer, pieces that we don't currently regulate. Department of Energy does have some appliance standards. There are also federal appliance standards that work, and if California has an appliance standard, most likely it's what we're going to see on the shelf here in Oregon. So but with that general comparison, I think we could probably say we're pretty close. If do we really want to do a comparison between us and local states? But when you hear we're behind, or we're ahead, this is some perspective to see where you want to go, you know, when you're looking at comparison to other places. On the commercial code side, so that was the residential side. We're moving into a commercial code adoption cycle coming up. The progression's been fairly similar between the residential and commercial provisions, sort of the timelines, what's happened. We had a lot of stuff that happened very early, much earlier than most states. We've had a lot of big jumps over the past 10 years, ever since the 07, 08 period. And again, our adoption process has worked pretty well. We continue to get input from multiple stakeholders. We've always had good feedback from the Department of Energy. A lot of people from Department of Energy have moved on to the Federal Department of Energy and providing input to them. We continue to have people before this board, both from inside and outside. We have people here in the audience who participate in national codes and standards. One of the things that we've had is we've seen what's coming up at the national level before it made it into code books, and sometimes we're able to get that in earlier than other people. I've had the good fortune to be able to be out and work on the IECC was able to do that for about 6 years, and know that in the upcoming model code on the mechanical side, it's going to be a lot easier to read and enforce, hopefully. So as we're moving to the next commercial cycle, excuse me here, the little highlighted change chart gets a little more difficult just simply due to commercial codes are a little more, there's a lot more involved. More air conditioning systems. In code, we regulate 2 different roof types, 4 wall types, 4 window types, 3 floor insulation types, and multiple types of air conditioning systems. There's 18 pages of mechanical code alone just on the HVAC system on the commercial side. That's almost double what we have for the entire residential code in Chapter 11. So it's pretty, it's a big piece, and when you're looking forward and backward in code, again, sometimes you may have one wall type that changes 20%. Another wall type may not change at all, and then a third wall type may change 40%, you know, as far as the requirements. And so tracking how codes change is a little tougher on the commercial side. But given that, as we're looking forward to the next codes, costs are something that you take into consideration. You know, the boards always make the recommendations looking at health, safety, welfare, but also as necessary for the conservation of precious resources. So as we would like to sort of take a look back at sort of what's happened with costs in the past, the residential code's very easy, or much easier to look at, just simply due to fewer things you're looking at changing, you know, a simpler building, easy to look at. The commercial code, as you saw earlier, is a bit more nuanced on how changes happen. And again, there are lots of different perspectives when it comes to costs. But we've been working on just some general numbers here. But looking at the residential code since the 2003 code, There are cost estimates that come out from lots and lots of different groups. The national, after every code update at the national level, the home builders bring out their estimates of cost. The U.S. Department of Energy, Pacific National Laboratory, they do a set of costs when they look at the code changes. We've seen costs come in from, let's see here, when Earth Advantage came in, they have one perspective on costs. This board, they'll make a declaration of, the estimated costs as well. And the ranges are pretty big. For a 2,400 square foot home, you could probably, looking since '03, you could say someone could say it was only $1,800. The next person could say up $14,000 or more. Based on sort of general looking at what's happened, it's probably on average somewhere around $4,000 for that typical home. And it probably saves somewhere around $320 a year, which on a straight line payback is about 12 and a half years. And when we're talking about financials and paybacks, we're not looking currently at, again, trying to throw in the exact number for what's happened with energy costs, financing assumptions, and what happened to material costs during this period. So this is just sort of on a general overview to see that it's about maybe somewhere around $4 to $6 a square foot, and maybe a 12 and a half year straight line payback if you're just looking at how much does that return for you. On commercial, again, we'd mentioned these prototype buildings from U.S. Department of Energy. So they give us you see the little building here, they have an Excel file that tells when it's occupied, how it's occupied, what all the construction materials are. So what we've been able to do is use these as saying, well, how many square feet of roof, ceiling, et cetera, and new glazing were affected through each code cycle, and did sort of a same sort of general analysis, again, 30,000 foot view, but for a 22,500 square foot strip mall, like the little building you'll see across the street, or really what you're in right now, you see about $112,000 cost increase and about an 8.5 year straight line return on investment based on the energy savings, and throwing in, of course, some guesstimates on what it cost, how much of the building was gas versus electricity. But one thing to remember is, yes, for the building owner isn't getting that payback. The tenants are getting the benefit of that, so it's built into the rent on those. It's something we're sort of putting out there for what you have to keep in mind on these. And also, we took a 53,000 square foot office building. These buildings have seen a lot more change in code due to the complexity of the mechanical systems, and 18 pages of just mechanical code alone. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 and about a 13-year payback for those buildings. We ran the DOE model secondary school. It's 211,000 square feet, about $900,000 if you just, somewhere in the middle on all of this, and about 9.5 years for that to pay back, and this is a public entity. They'll be more than happy to have this because they are really long-term owners on those buildings. But overall, over the years, of these more recent code changes, of looking at these few buildings, a parking lot probably has seen very little, or a parking deck has seen very little cost change, but $3 to $6 a square foot, a 7 to 15 year payback. This is the long view that these codes have had, in the recent history. And so in summary on sort of where the HIT code has been and looking forward to the next code cycles, there are a lot of things that are still outside of your control. When it comes to what's going to be happening to natural gas costs and electricity prices, utilities, what's happening, we have a renewable portfolio, clean grid is affecting the electrical energy side and costs there. We're seeing new technologies, distributed generation, the effects of photovoltaics and renewables on the power system, just things that are outside of your control that are going to be affecting potentially decisions you make when you're looking at energy code in the future. And keeping some of that long look, it's, you also are going to have, be continuing to look at, this is a statewide code. How does it affect people in the valley, in rural Oregon, on the coast, different communities? We're having a bit of, there's an affordable housing crisis that's pretty much hitting the news, and everyone's looking at that. And how does that affect affordable housing? We've been told, and it's obvious that, yes, there are harder choices coming. The model codes that we used to rely on are having a harder time moving forward, coming up and getting agreement on those things. We've looked to incentive programs, in the past. Sometimes they were the test bed for things we could bring into code. It's getting harder and harder to find things from their programs to bring in. But again, we've got a flexible system. You can look at the best of all worlds and try and find things that work for us. And hopefully we'll be seeing, and we're hearing, there's some new technology coming forward. We may be seeing market transformation as things become more common in the marketplace. It's going to become cheaper to bring in new efficiency. So for your economic analysis or looking at this, there may be some tools that you might need to look at this. And we'll be looking to you to, what you're going to be considering, where you're going to look at commercial costs versus residential costs versus multifamily residential. Summary, it is complicated, but it's important. And don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. These boards have done really well for 40 years. I think we can continue to do so. But this has just been sort of an overview of the energy codes, so far, to sort of rehash one more time, refreshing the building code system. And with that, we're going to go to one more fun little thing here, just to sort of see, when it gets complicated, how some other states are looking at this. You know that state of California has a 2020 deadline they were shooting to have zero net energy homes, so that they were going to have homes that had enough renewable power on the homes to offset over the course of the year all of the energy that a single-family residence has. That is their goal. It was to be in their 2009, it's supposed to be in their 2019 code that's now on the road show. We took some of their slides just to show you what they're going through and some of the thought process, how detailed that can get. But these slides they've made their rule. They're doing their public hearing to roll out, here's what's going to happen, here's how we came to these decisions. And as they say, reality turns out to be a bit more nuanced when it comes to zero energy. They've learned a lot. They've seen what's happening with the effects of their renewable portfolio standard. What's happening is they're bringing more solar and renewables onto their power grid. Complications with net energy metering. Each state is having issues. Hawaii, Arizona, California just are all looking at how much does the utility pay you for excess solar, because to meet zero energy, these solar panels on the roof of the home have to generate excess energy that they're selling back to the utility to make up for what the home uses at night. So they wanted to average out that over the year, these solar panels make up for all the energy the home uses. So here's my technical geek code slide. Those of you in the energy world have heard of something called a duck curve. I just want to this was part of their rollout to show why looking at solar and putting photovoltaics on homes can be a little tricky. This is looking at the energy used or produced and used by the California power grid, all the ISOs down there. The California power grid, on the left side, you're seeing megawatts of generation. So we have 20,000 at midnight on a spring day in California. All of the power plants in California are trying to put on about 20,000 megawatts of power onto the grid to make up for what's being used in the home. So they're trying to balance that out. Then on a spring day, you don't see much of a, we'll look at the 2012 line. As you get towards 6 a.m., 9 a.m., the power demand starts to go up as people are turning on work power. More energy is being used. Electric water heaters are making up for the showers that were taken earlier in the morning. The demand went up, and then on a spring day, toward the end of the day, you're starting to see the peak, the effect of the sun on the buildings all day. The air conditioning loads are starting to go up a little bit. Spring normally aren't starting out the day with a lot of air conditioning on homes and businesses. So around 5 or 6 o'clock, you start seeing the demand climb up because people are going home. They're starting dinner. They're turning on electric ranges. They're turning on their TV. They're turning on the lights at home. But the lights at work still aren't off. So this is where that peak is happening on a spring day for their power grid. Well, the next lines, if you look at this, as you go down through 2013, 2014, you're starting to see a dip appear. What's happening is more photovoltaics were really coming online in the state of California. There was a big push to get more solar power onto the system. Well, as the sun comes out, all of this solar is getting pushed onto the grid. The power companies have to, so there's less demand, so the power companies have to shut off generation capacity. And slowly over time, in 2016, they saw what used to be in 2013 around 20,000 megawatts of power they needed to have, generation power they needed to have on. They hit as low as 11,000. And it has the potential to go even lower as more solar is coming onto their grid. But once the sun starts going down, what happens? It's not generating power anymore. So they have to turn power plants back on. And so this is creating a conundrum for their power grid. And it has, so we're seeing this drop from 7 to 11 a.m. and then having to ramp back up in the evening. And it does have a bit of an effect on the state of Oregon, because in spring, what is Bonneville Power seeing? Lots of flow through the dams. And you've heard of the call to shut off wind power generation. It is affecting us. It's flowing uphill to the state of Oregon in some way. So again, real time in February of 2016, over 3 hours, the California utilities had to turn back on almost 11,000 megawatts of power capacity. They had to find a place to either short-term generation, buy from Oregon, get somewhere into their grid to make up for the fact that they had this sudden increase in demand. So these are from the California Energy Commission slides they're rolling out theirs to sort of explain why they're making the decisions they're making when it comes to getting to a zero net energy residence for their code. One other issue is, and whether it's residential or commercial, plug loads aren't going away. No matter what, on the home, there's cooking, there's lighting, there's the TVs, the chargers, all the other electronics in the home. What they're discovering that is within the practical range of what they can do for efficiency measures, you can, even if they eliminate all heating, cooling, and hot water and ventilation loads, what's left over of that energy use in a home may not be able to be made up for by the photovoltaics, because you could make everything else disappear, and PV is still going to be a tough question for code adoption. So they had to look at that in the long run. So another fun, just technical, high-level overview. They went and looked at how much photovoltaics a home would need. First, they determined they're going to be, for a 2,700 square foot, we're going to call this a mixed use, gas heat, electric for everything else home. What's going to happen to the home when it comes to net metering? Are we going to tell people to put too much solar on the home that the power company no longer has to give them money for the excess generation? Or how is it affecting that duct curve? How is it affecting grid harmonization? So that's what grid harmonization is. What's it doing to the power grid and our generators, and is it making it difficult for the power companies? When it comes to net metering, NEM, is the homeowner going to get money for all of the solar that they generate? So they went through different scenarios. They came up with a final code, or what they're rolling out is for 2019, they're going to have updates in most climate zones to the attics and the walls. They're now going to require a home rater for every single home. And what that home rater is going to do is take your plans, look at it, and assign a value for energy usage, and then the home rater, through a special program, state program, will back out the energy used for water heating and electric space heating. So it takes out that piece of the pie, which you saw disappear up there, and that's what the photovoltaics needs to be sized for. So they'll use that. They're going to base it on so that gas homes have the same amount of PV as an electric home, all electric home.
So not to break your rhythm here, real quick, Mark, though. So is it what that's saying is then that it'll be net zero electric, but the gas side kind of gets a pass? Or
The gas side gets a pass, and so does if you were if this were an all electric home. Anything for space heating and space water heat or domestic water heating gets subtracted out for that home as well. So it'll offset everything but what's used for heating and for water heating. Okay. So they aren't quite to zero. They're getting really close, but they're finding it difficult to get to that. Okay. So now for what they're showing people for the cost of this. We have the equivalent of climate zones 1 and 16. They're requiring higher performance walls, so additional exterior insulation. They're saying $900 for a 2,700 square foot home. Attics in most climate zones will have to get some additional insulation in them. Then the QII, that's the home rater. I think it's Quality Insulation Inspector is what the QII stands for. So you're going to pay for a home rater who will then tell you how big your solar PV system needs to be. In climate zone 1, a 2,700 square foot home may need somewhere around a 3.2 kilowatt PV system. And the bottom line cost for equivalent Oregon climate zones are for a 2,700 square foot home between $10,000 and $11,000 is where they're going to see for their code increase. So they're letting people know what's coming down cost-wise. Washington does things a little differently. Some of these slides these same spreadsheets were part of the Earth Advantage presentation. When Washington's committee went through their code cycle, they used a state-created spreadsheet. This was a spreadsheet that was developed so that all state buildings had to look at not only at a 50-year life cycle cost of the building. So after 50 years, did the state spend less money than they would have if they hadn't done an energy improvement? They also have an extra line for the societal life cycle cost of carbon. So they add all these pieces in. These are the slides from one of their all-gas homes. For the 2015 code, they had about $4,000 cost increase for one of their combinations of points for 3.5 points. It saves, under the life cycle, about $4,000 over a 50-year lifespan. So do you look that long term? How are you going to measure this? Of course, they had the cost, inflation of energy, a bunch of other pieces were thrown into this, but it's a lot of workings in a specialized program, and that it's something that was developed for state buildings. So sort of a minor look back at the big chart again. We can compare to states that have no statewide code or are totally, local rule, home rule type states where, city A has a code, city B does not. We can compare to states where, yes, there's a statewide energy code, but the biggest cities in those states don't have the latest code or don't enforce it at all. Our neighbors to the north went through a process where, they're looking at at codes and doing it through their process, through a committee that then brings things out and looks at it on a 50-year life cycle cost. We have California now that's going to have really a third party tell you what your basic code compliance path is now and how much you have to spend on your home, and then the building official comes in and looks at it. So it's complicated, it's difficult, but the division wanted, for this little additional piece here to consider some of the questions that are out there. What for an energy code should be mandatory? What should be incentivized? How do you make that work? When does the cost become too much? What sort of life cycle do you compare to? When you're looking at long run, is it 1 year versus 2 years, 10 years, 5 years? How do you spread this out? How do you look at a single-family residence versus a commercial structure? And there's so many different commercial structure types and how people own these, how people operate these. We've had feedback in the past. What feedback are you going to need in the future to weigh when you're considering code changes? And when it comes to efficiency, what are the best uses? How much needs to be in the building? A lot of efficiency that's coming is going to be outside the building, as the power grid gets more renewable, as we see changes that are going on out there, things outside the building code. Who's going to bear the cost of the efficiency changes that are helping you in the home versus outside the home? Again, back to my wonderful low-hanging fruit phrase, where can the code make the biggest impact? Where can you do the best? Where can you do that within the long view of where the code is going? And how can you continue to act strategically when the technology does change? How can you relook at it? Can you take that in and get it into the current code?